This is the DRF Players Podcast. Here are your hosts, Peter Thomas Fornatel and Jonathan Kinchin.
Hello and welcome to the DRF Players Podcast. I'm your host, Peter Thomas Fornatel, here with you for a special edition of the show, something different than anything we've done before. This is a tribute to the life and writing of William Nack, who passed away this week. Nack was a giant in the field of not just racing journalism, not just journalism, but I'd go so far as to say literature. His writings meant so much to me throughout the course of my life since I was first exposed to it, reading it in the pages of Sports Illustrated many years ago. For this show, we brought in three folks who knew Nack really well to share their reminiscences of his life and times. First up, we're going to hear from Steve Crist, the publisher emeritus of Daily Racing Form. Then we're going to talk to Bob Curran, retired now, who was the top communications guy at the Jockey Club. And then we're going to hear from Tim Layden from Sports Illustrated, who worked with Nack for many years. For those of you who don't know, Nack in his career won 7 Eclipse Awards. He also received a Penn ESPN Lifetime Achievement Award. You've heard his voice before. He's done a lot of great voiceover work at the start of racing broadcasts, and you've probably seen him in movies as he's portrayed in both the Secretariat film and the movie that ESPN did about Ruffian roughly 10 or 11 years ago, where he was portrayed by Frank Whaley, I believe was the guy's name. Without further ado, let's go to the first of these conversations. Welcome back to the DRF Players Podcast. Publisher emeritus of Daily Racing Form, Steve Crist. Steve, how are you today?
Hey, Pete. Pretty good, thanks.
Thanks for joining us. I wanted to get your memories of Bill Nack. I know you worked not as a colleague, but in a sense alongside him for a long time. When did your paths first cross?
Oh, I first met Bill when I became the racing writer for the New York Times in 1981, and I really was, just thrown into the pool on that. And Bill was one of the first people to really take me in under his wing, show me where the backstretch was, tell me how to do the job. And he was a tremendous help to me. I mean, he was, anyone who worked with him will tell you, especially those of us just a little bit younger than Bill, that when you first came around, Joe Hirsch and Bill Nack were the two guys who took care of the younger guys and helped them out. And he was just so generous with his time, and he genuinely rooted for you. And he was just a terrific guy to come up under.
Were you very familiar with his work at the time you started? I mean, famously, you came to being a racing fan a little bit later. But had his work permeated your sphere at that point?
Yeah, I had read the Secretariat book, and that book stands as perhaps the greatest turf writing of the 20th century. Bill was, when he was working for Newsday, the daily paper on Long Island, he was the racing writer. And he followed Secretariat around during that Triple Crown. I mean, he stayed with the horse for 40 days. He slept outside the horse's stall the night before the Belmont Stakes. He was his biographer, his Boswell, as people like to say. And he researched everything about the horse and his connections so thoroughly and then wove it together into this beautifully written book. I mean, first and foremost and above all, Bill was just a great writer, or horse racing, or anything else. I mean, I'm not a big boxing fan, but boxing people love his work in that area as well. But Bill's Secretariat book still stands as a shining thing. And when people start to get interested in racing, I always tell them, well, you got to read Nack's book on Secretariat. It's the classic.
Am I correct that at the time it came out, what you might call narrative nonfiction, which had such an explosion in the 90s, wasn't as big of a thing? Is it elevating Nack too much to call him somebody who was really an innovator in this category that ended up taking over so much of the bestseller lists as time went on?
I think that it's very fair to give him credit for that. When Bill wrote for Sports Illustrated for more than a decade and just one great piece after another, he was the master of long form writing. Most of us reporters, you banged out your 800 words on deadline and that was it. But Bill was writing these 5,000 to 10,000 word pieces. And really just took the time to turn them practically into novels.
How much do you think his love of literature informed his sports writing?
I think that he was our most literary turf writer who I can think of. He had such an ear for language. And, he's famous for having recited on special occasions the last page of The Great Gatsby, which he had memorized. It wasn't a show-offy parlor trick thing. It was just that that's such a beautifully written page that Bill would recite it, and it was, like an actor giving a performance. I mean, he felt every word of it. And in all of his writing, he really took the time. I mean, every word was chosen carefully and deliberately.
You talk about the performance aspect. He also, in later days, became a voiceover guy, doing stuff for various racing broadcasts, and he was unbelievable at it. I always was surprised by that. You don't typically think of those talents necessarily going together, the ability to craft words and the ability to perform words. Where do you think that came from in Nack?
I think a lot of it was his love of words and literature. He'd read something he liked, and he'd want to read it to you and to sound it out, and that was a big part of his ear for language. And when he started doing those things at the beginning of telecasts, that kind of voice of God introduction's a bit of a cliche, and it's frequently, someone hands an anchor type a script and the guy reads it. But Bill composed those things very carefully, and when he read them, you knew you were not only hearing from someone with authority, but again from someone who had chosen and composed those words very carefully.
I think that was definitely a big part of their success and their impact, and why some of those voice of God pieces work better than others. I wanted to ask you, as a writer yourself, obviously, was there an intimidation factor ever reading his work, or was it just such an apples and oranges thing, as you said, 800 words on deadline versus 10,000 words you have a chance to craft?
I think it was only a positive. I mean, you'd sit down and read one of Bill's epics, and you were envious, and it made you want to spend a little more time polishing your stuff and to make it a little bit better, because you saw that it was possible to do some really careful, good writing in thoroughbred racing. And, there's long been an affinity, between literature and horse racing, and racing has appealed to a lot of writers, and it's always kind of inspiring to see a really good writer take on racing, and it makes you feel like, wow, this can be done, and it's worth spending that extra time and giving your piece one more polish, because when it works, it really works.
That's great. Do you think he saw himself as part of racing's literary tradition, Joe Palmer, people like that, or did he come at it from a different enough angle that he saw himself as more singular?
No, I think he did. He was different from most racing writers. I mean, if you at any time in the middle of a season had said to Bill, who are the three best 3-year-old fillies in the country, he'd have had no idea. He found topics that interested him and dived into them, but he wasn't a guy who was handicapping every day. He just found in racing, which had been an important part of his life since he was a teenager, that this was his field, this was his area where he could really sing about this stuff. You know, I mean, Bill had been a groom at Arlington Park in the late 50s, and Swaps had been his idol in the 50s, you know, his formative years that way. And, if you're lucky as a writer, you find what really sings to you. And Bill found that in racing and reportedly in a couple other sports as well.
What did he think of horse players?
He really liked the horse players, and he was very supportive. You know, he didn't really have the kind of flat platform in Sports Illustrated. He wasn't going to take on horse player issues, but he was very supportive of me and Andy Beyer and people who were doing that sort of thing. And he was always on our side, even if it wasn't what he chose to write about.
Perhaps his most controversial piece, at least when it comes to racing, came out in the early 90s when he took on an issue that's still an issue today, frankly, about the overuse of corticosteroids in racing. It was a piece called The Breaking Point. And from what I understand, and I'd love some clarification on this because you read a few random lines in an obituary and they don't always capture the way things really were, but it sounds like there were some within racing who took issue when he was looking into the sort of darker aspects of racing. But I'm assuming that it came from a place of love and wanting the sport to be better and wanting to treat our equine heroes and athletes better. Do you remember the controversy surrounding that? And where do you think Bill was coming from in writing that piece?
Well, I think you're absolutely right about where Bill was coming from. I mean, he loved horses and was always concerned about their welfare. And the corticosteroids piece that he did, I think it broke his heart that a lot of people in the Lexington area and the breeding community and the big farms down there who gotten to know very well in the course of researching the Secretariat book and other things, that some of those people turned on him. And, why are you writing anything negative about horse racing? And this is something that all of us in this field have faced from time to time, that participants in the sport don't want to read about troublesome issues like that. And a lot of them felt, well, you say you like racing, but now you're doing this critical piece in a national magazine, and the public's going to get turned off. And, I don't think Bill ever mended all of those fences with those people. But, as we all learn, there just comes a time where you have to agree to disagree with people.
If you don't write pieces like that, how are you ever going to make things better, would be what I would say in defense of him. And I imagine you faced plenty of that criticism in the way you've written about the economic structure of the game over the years. Is it worth it? Is it worth trying to make things better, even though a lot of people who theoretically your interests you have at heart aren't going to see it for the way it's intended to be?
Yeah, I mean, it may not seem that way at the time, but then you look back, 10 or 20 years later, and, positive changes do happen. And I think the game is a lot better today than when I first came around, certainly for the player, which was kind of my soapbox for a number of years. And you know what? We got some very good stuff done, and you bang your head against the wall long enough. I mean, I was yelling about the IRS regulations for literally 25 years, and lo and behold, it finally worked. So, it's worth sticking with these things.
Any other stories or thoughts or memories of Bill Nack you'd like to share with us today, Steve?
Oh, gosh, Bill became such a close friend, and he was instrumental in, hooking me up with my future wife, Robin Foster. And Bill's actually the person I spent the night before my wedding with. What began with four guys seeing how much they could drink just turned into me and Bill wandering around Manhattan at 4 a.m. And so that's a nice memory of my last day as a single man.
Oh, that's fabulous stuff. Steve, thank you for taking time out. I know you're taking this retirement thing seriously, and it means a lot to me that you came on today to talk about Bill and share some memories with us. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Pete.
Now I'd like to welcome to the podcast for his first appearance on the podcast, Bob Curran, who recently retired as the VP of Corporate Communications at the Jockey Club, but is keeping busy with various writing projects. Bob, how are you doing today?
I'm great, Peter. Thanks for having me. I'm honored and glad to be on with you.
Well, you were one of the first people I thought of when paying tribute to Bill Nack, because while I had the pleasure of meeting him quickly a couple of times before Steve Crist's retirement party a few years ago, it was at Steve Crist's retirement party where, thanks to you and the fact that you deemed me worthy to talk to, that I got the most time that I ever got to have speaking with Bill about various subjects. And you had subsequently put me on to some amazing, maybe lesser known, but no less quality writings by Bill Nack. So I wanted to ask you where your paths first crossed.
Yeah, I worked in the Naira press office in the early 80s, so I think I met Bill for the first time then. But through the years, obviously, at all the Triple Crown races and Breeders' Cup, our paths would cross. I always admired his writing immensely. There have been some beautiful things written about him in the last few days. Tim Layden at Sportsil, of course, did a nice piece. Today's New York Times has a very good obit. And he was just a fun guy to be around, a great writer. I think horse racing was lucky to have him, although, as you mentioned, he really distinguished himself with many other subjects and personality profiles. And it just seemed like he was made for Sportsil, and Sports Illustrated was made for him with that long-form journalism. So we're going to miss him as a sport and as a person, personally and professionally. We'll miss him all.
You tied into his career in a professional way as well as a personal way, if I'm remembering the story correctly. And it has to do with one of those pieces you mentioned to me after that meeting, and it has to do with the Vietnam War, a subject that I'm sure was very close to the heart of Nack, as he's somebody who served over there. And I'm talking, of course, about the story about Bob Kalsu.
Yeah, Bob Kalsu, for any of your listeners who may not know, was a Buffalo Bills player in the late 60s, and he was killed in Vietnam. And my dad was a newspaper columnist in Buffalo and often wrote about Bob Kalsu. And he had been one of the only major professional sports athletes killed in Vietnam. I think he was an offensive tackle or guard out of Oklahoma. But he was killed, and my dad kind of kept his memory alive. And eventually the Buffalo Bills inducted him into their Wall of Fame in Buffalo. And through that, I got to know his widow a little bit. She visited my dad later in his life when he was in a nursing home in Buffalo. And just one of those fluke things that happens in life. One day, I think I had just gotten an email or a phone call from Jan Kalsu, the widow, and had just about hung up. And my phone rings in the office, and it's Bill Nack. And he had a question about secretariat or a statistic, although it's hard to imagine him not knowing every statistic that existed. But anyway, he called me, and we were just about done with the conversation. I said, "Hey, Bill, by the way, did you ever hear of a guy named Bob Kalsu?" And he never had, and I gave him a brief description like we just did. He said, "That sounds like a story to me." And I, with the permission of Jan Kalsu, I gave her numbers to Bill. And the next thing you know, he was on a plane to go out to Oklahoma to visit her. And it turned out to be the last story that he ever did for Sports Illustrated. He took a buyout right after that, but it was a cover story. I believe it was called A Name on the Wall, and anyone who wants to read it can just look it up in the SI Vault on their website. They have a lot of old stories. It's a wonderful story. He ended up tracking down people that had served with Bob Kalsu They invited him to a reunion a few years later, and it was just a great, great story. I think at one point some of the Hollywood studios were interested in doing something, but that never came to be. And one other thing that I don't think I've read anywhere, but Bill had told me, you mentioned him serving in Vietnam. Bill told me, even though he lived in D.C., he had never been to the Vietnam Memorial to see the names on the wall down there because he just lost too many friends and would get too upset by visiting. And I've been there many times. I did not serve in Vietnam, but admire anyone who did. And it's just amazing to me that someone like Bill, just really couldn't bring himself to even visit that memorial.
I mean, a lot of personal pain has got to be in play when it comes to that, and I think he might have channeled some of that pain in the way he executed the Kalsu profile. As a writer, he was known for those cinematic treatments. It doesn't surprise me at all that you say that there were studios potentially interested in that as a story. What did it mean to you, who is obviously familiar with the Kalsu story? What did it mean for a subject to get the Bill Nack treatment in Sports Illustrated?
Well, Peter, I spent a good part of my career publicizing horse racing and the people and the events in it. So it was kind of ironic that I wouldn't even call it a placement because I wasn't really looking to publicize Bob Kalsu. It was just the way the day unfolded. But, certainly to have someone do a cover story and for Sports Illustrated, that kind of germinated with an idea that you mentioned to them was kind of personally rewarding. And just because of my dad, because of the Kalsus, because of Bill, it was kind of a bonding experience that we talked about for many years, Bill and I.
Bill had many skills, oration, another one in addition to his fantastic work on the page. We talked about this a little bit in the chat with Steve Crist that opened the show. You had the pleasure, I think, many times of getting to see him in action as a public speaker.
Yeah, there's one that stands out. One year up in Saratoga, the Jockey Club would always host this Jockey Club Roundtable Conference. It was a 2-hour event, and still goes on and has been for 65 years, where we try to shed some light on some projects that are helping move the industry forward. And the night before the roundtable, Denny Phipps would always have a dinner for the members of the Jockey Club who were in town. It was held at the National Museum of Racing and still is. And one year Denny asked me, he said, can you come up with some ideas for a speaker for our dinner Saturday night? And the first person I thought of was Bill. And then he said, well, what would he talk about? I said, oh, don't worry. He's got some funny stories from covering horse racing all these years. And this was really funny, Peter, the way things work out. That year we had an international speaker coming over, and we made a reservation in a nice hotel and a suite in the hotel for the speaker. And at the last minute, his wife took ill and he couldn't make it. And the president of the Jockey Club at the time, a guy named Hans Stahl, said, well, give Nack the suite. He's coming up to speak at the dinner. So he had this luxurious suite in the hotel in Saratoga. And the night of the dinner, about a half an hour before we were supposed to drive over to the museum, Bill calls me. He says, come here, I want you to hear my speech. So I went to his room, and he had handwritten on a yellow legal pad the whole speech. And he read it to me. And it traced his career in Newsday and Sports Illustrated and, his memorizing all the Derby winners since the beginning. And he finished, he said, what do you think? And I looked at him, I said, Bill, I feel like I just saw Secretary at Belmont a half an hour before everyone else did. And sure enough, 2 hours later, he delivered the speech, and he just brought the legal pad up, read it, as if it was he's reading a story he'd written, which in essence it really was. And the room just erupted in applause and a standing ovation, and it was really great. And he loved the attention and he loved the reception. And a couple of years later, the Hall of Fame heard about it, and they invited him to be the guest speaker at their induction ceremony. So that was another kind of a bonding experience for us, too.
We were talking off air about some of his very best writing. Another piece that maybe not everyone has read that's probably worth seeking out in the corners of the internet is the piece he wrote about tracking down Robbie Davis after Davis was involved in the tragic accident at Belmont Park that ended up killing Mike Venezia. What is it about that piece that made it so special?
Well, a couple elements, I think, Peter. First, Robbie, was on the horse that kicked Mike Venezia, and he felt terrible about it, and he left New York immediately, went back to his hometown of Pocatello, Idaho, if I'm not mistaken, and just no one could get in touch with him or talk to him or anything. And I don't know if it was just his own personal or professional curiosity, but Bill Nack was determined to get to Robbie and talk to him. And I think he tried calling a few times and never got a response, but knew he was living in an RV or something in Pocatello, Idaho. And as he was wont to do, Bill jumped on a plane, went out and knocked on the door of the RV. And I don't even know that Robbie agreed to it at first, but Bill didn't go away. And eventually they spent a lot of time together. They became friends. Bill wrote a piece that won an Eclipse Award, and it talked about a lot of bad memories and personal things that Robbie had been through growing up and some abuse situations with a stepfather or something like that. But as I said, Bill won the Eclipse Award, and he had that way of just kind of, he didn't care so much about the result or how many lengths a horse won by, with the exception of 31. He was more interested in the people behind the athletes and what made them tick. And I think that's what made him the great writer he was.
Amazing to be able to make that connection and to establish such a connection with your subject, to be able to go there, showing up unannounced, and apparently, as the story goes, waiting for smoke to be coming out of the trailer or the cabin, so we knew people were awake, making his approach, and eventually getting a deep enough connection with his subject to get that kind of deep, personal, revealing detail. That's just some of the amazing skills that he had as a journalist and a writer. But before I let you go, Bob, unless you had a follow-up on that.
Well, I was just going to say one other thing, Peter. If you look at videos and still photos sometimes of big races, Bill was in a lot of those pictures and videos. And it wasn't because he wanted his picture taken, but he just had a knack for, pardon the pun, for sneaking by security guards. And he'd be in the winner's circle, or he'd be in a dinner, or, he was always right there. And he was usually the only journalist there. And I don't even know if he had a credential or he just didn't stop when someone told him he couldn't go someplace. But I think that was part of why he had such material that no one else had.
There's an amazing story. I don't know if it was in the Sandomir obit or in something that Ray Pollock wrote about how he's somehow in photos getting the reaction shots of Mr. Hancock and Mr. Phipps in the Breeders' Cup Classic of 1989 as Sunday Silence and Easy Goer Battle. He's somehow in two places at once. I mean, that's the kind of supernatural skill that he possessed. Amazing stuff.
Again, I mentioned that SI Vault. It has some of the old stories. If any of your listeners want to go, I mean, the Robbie Davis piece is one. The Bob Kalsu piece is one. He spent a summer, and we used to kid him about this was the greatest assignment in history. Sports Illustrated sent him out to Del Mar one year to spend 6 weeks there on expense account to write a piece for the following July. But all those stories, and one he did that was very well known was about Bobby Fischer, the chess master. He chased him around because he was a recluse, and finally found him and didn't. He didn't want to violate his privacy, even though he'd been searching for him for 6 weeks or something and finally found him. But those are all great pieces that people could look up on the SI website.
Absolutely. And the book, My Turf, that's one that I would recommend. That's a collection that has a lot of these pieces. We mentioned at the top of the show that he won 7 Eclipse Awards. You can find some of those in the book, My Turf, and find the rest through the SI vault, as Bob was saying. There's one story I want you to tell quickly. I've taken too much of your time already, but that sort of ties back in to my mentor and the guy who introduced us many years ago at Belmont Park, the racing writer William Murray. Does this connect? I'm taking a wild guess that this may have connected to the 6 weeks that Nack spent at Del Mar. We joke on the podcast a lot. We have a friend we call the Prince of Keeneland. William Murray was the Prince of Del Mar back in the day. What's the connection there?
Well, I mean, as you know, I got to know William Murray and read all his books. Shifty Lou Anderson, just thought the world of him as a person and as a writer. And I spent some enjoyable time with him at Del Mar as well. But I reread the story this morning, and sure enough, I mean, Bill had a good nose for characters, and Bill Nack did. I mean, and William Murray did too, and he picked up a lot of his material at the racetrack too. But those two were destined to be friends, and that article that ran in 1991, William Murray is quoted at length throughout it, and it brings me a little bit of joy to think of them being together again.
That's great. That's fantastic. And you know what? I'll dig out that link. Maybe I'll dig out links for several of these pieces we've talked about, Bob, and send them out on Twitter so folks don't have to do the digging themselves. But I've never read that Del Mar one, I'll be honest. So that's going to be an exciting treat for me this afternoon. Thank you for taking the time out and coming to join us today, and hopefully we can have you back soon.
I appreciate your efforts and your love of the game as well.
And now I'd like to welcome to the podcast Tim Layden of Sports Illustrated. Tim, how are you doing today?
I'm very good. Very good.
It's obviously a somber occasion, but I know you were very close to Bill, and I sense from reading some of your fantastic writing over the years that he was a major influence on your work as well. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I've tried to come to terms with that a little bit. I think that, I was talking with Jack McCallum and Greg Kelly and Mike Farber, some of my former SI colleagues this week. And I think what I would say is that, reading Bill's stuff on horse racing in the late 70s and early 80s when I was working in Albany for small papers, and a part of my job was covering horse racing, and I was trying to figure out how to write about it. And reading Bill's stuff, definitely, in reading his stuff both as a horse racing writer and as a journalist, I kind of thought, this is a voice that I think I can aspire to. I wouldn't say I tried to mimic it. And the other guy was Kenny Moore, who also wrote for Sports Illustrated on running and track and field. And there was another guy whose writing, I thought, there's certain people you'd see that you can't really. I'd read Lee Montville when I was in college. I thought, I can't do that. I can't be funny like that. But I read Nack and thought, wow, this is the way this guy digs and reports and then tries to tell a story. I want to try and do that. And then Kenny was the same way, and I wound up succeeding both of them at Sports Illustrated, which is deeply weird and strange, but that's the way it happened.
When did you first become aware of Bill's work?
Well, I'm sure it was in the late 70s when he was at SI. I did not read Bill at Newsday. I went back and read his Newsday stuff when I went to Newsday in 1988. By then, Bill was gone. He was at Newsday from 70 to 78, and I didn't read his stuff there because, again, part of that time I was in high school, part of the time I was in college in Massachusetts, and we all read the Boston papers, mainly the Globe and some of the New York papers. And I read the New York papers growing up, but not Newsday because Newsday hadn't really, made its way into New York by then. So I became aware of Bill through his horse racing and other feature writing at SI once he got there in the 78 and then into the 80s when I was in the newspaper part of my career.
What was special about the way he tackled his subjects?
I think what was special, and it's parallel, I think, Pete, with what a lot of people did and have done with journalism and sports journalism since then, and that was that Bill took, the way that horse racing had been covered reverentially, really reverentially, or from a gambling perspective for many, many years. We talked off air, and I mentioned Charles Hatton of the Daily Racing Form, and a lot of great writers, Red Smith and Grantland Rice, all those people wrote about horse racing and boxing, and two things that Bill wound up writing about. And I think what Bill did is he had a natural curiosity and a natural interest in people and stories, and he brought that to horse racing to match up with his great writing ability. And what you get when you put those things together was just a guy who was able to tell the stories of the racetrack, but not just tell them, but also report them. And I just think it revolutionized writing about that sport, and in a way that people still aspire to now.
You mentioned off air that he brought racing the same sort of serious narrative, journalistic approach that other subjects were used to receiving. Is that something that was hearkening back to an older way of covering the sport, or is that something that was it truly a revolution in the way the sport was covered?
Well, both. I think there were some great poets of sports writing in the 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s. People like W.C. Hines, who was also a reporter, and Grantland Rice, and others, and they, when they wrote about horse racing, in many cases they wrote about it from an informed but distant perspective. They knew the sport, they knew the English language, and they knew a lot of things, but the whole, I hate the term, but I'll use it because it's familiar to people, the whole new journalism thing of the 60s and 70s was late coming to horse racing, I think. And Bill was the guy that, and I'm going to slight somebody who did this just as well as Bill, but I don't know that person, so I apologize to the nameless writers that I'm insulting here. But Bill did it for a large audience. He really got to know the people, and he dug into their stories, and he did journalism, and then applied to it a really old school voice. That sort of beautiful prose that kind of walks right up to the line of being purple, but stops short of it. That's kind of the perfect writing that takes you, that really elevates the work with great writing, but doesn't go over that line into overwriting. And Bill was really great at that. And he would drop phrases in that you would have seen in writing in the 50s and 40s, but he did it in a way that he made it work.
Arms like picnic hams. That kind of thing is what's coming to mind when you describe that.
Yes.
Just very descriptive and perfect. How about your personal relationship with Bill? When did you guys first meet?
Well, I don't remember the first time we met, but it had to have been at Saratoga, 79, 80, something like that. When he was first at SI, and when he got to SI, Bill Leggett was still there, and Billy Reed came in later. Demi Stathopoulos, who also passed away, was on. There were 3 or 4 people that had a lot of horse racing in their background, and so Bill was not always there at every big race that I covered, but he was there often enough, and you immediately, if you were reading his work, you immediately knew that he was great. And so, my first visceral memory of meeting Bill was at the 1980 Travers, and I was in the jocks room at Saratoga interviewing some of the jockeys. Bill had clearly been somewhere else working some other angle, and I came out of the jocks room, and Bill stopped me. And he didn't know me. He just knew that I was one of the local guys that was covering the race. And he said, did you talk to, and whoever the jock was, I can't remember who it was. It might've been Cordero. I'm not sure who it was that I had been talking to. But Bill said, did you talk to so-and-so? And I said, yeah, I did. And Bill said, was he good? And I said, yeah, it's pretty good. And Bill started to walk in, and I stopped, and I said, Bill, I think he's gone. And I was 100% sure he was gone because I walked out with him. And I think it was Cordero. And now that I'm starting to see the picture in my head now. And so Bill just said, "Do you have anything from him?" And I said, "Well, I got a lot." Yeah. And I gave him a couple of the best quotes, and they didn't wind up in Bill's story, but it was a big thrill to me that, and you know that in our business, everybody trades because you can't be everywhere. And, you can't be in both locker rooms. You can't be walking to the backside with a winning trainer and in the jock's room with a winning jock. So it was a thrill to give Bill Nack a quote
That's awesome.
that he didn't get. And I did not ask him for one in return.
Steve Crist describes him as somebody who really was interested in taking the younger reporters under his wing and helping and guiding them through parts of their career. Was that your experience as well?
Bill was always, when I was in Albany in the mid to late 80s covering a lot of racing, and then through the 88 to 95 when I was at Newsday, I would see Bill a lot. I never felt like he was mentoring me when we would talk. I thought it was cool that he would just talk to me like I was a colleague or a peer. You could walk up to Bill and you could ask him for a piece of information and he would give you a 10-minute story in return, which was a great return on your investment for that kind of thing. But you could also I always found that, Bill knew 1,000 times more than I did about horse racing when I was early in the business. And yet when we would talk, he was happy to give and take with me, and, listen. He would listen as well as he would talk. And that's what I loved about it. That's kind of what I love about the business I'm in, because, I've gone from being a young writer to being an old writer and everything in between. But, I love that someone who's 60 can be a peer with someone who's 25. And I thought Bill was a great example of that. I didn't know Bill when he was 25 or 30. I only knew him when he was in his 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s. And I was, half a generation or a generation, 3/4 of a generation younger than him. But he always treated me and almost everybody else I saw like an equal. You want to talk to me? Let's talk. And I love that about journalism and sports writing, and I loved it about Bill.
One thing that strikes me about his work, whether it's no matter what the sport is, but no case is it more pronounced than writing about Secretariat, but the way he's able to establish a connection with a subject that is seemingly not possible for just a journalist covering a topic as a peer, as a colleague. How do you think he was able to get so close to the topics he was writing about?
It's interesting as you're saying that, Pete. I start to think, we're sort of in narrative storytelling now, narrative nonfiction, as you referred to it. I think off air when we were talking, I had Bill. There's a lot of first person writing in that now, and Bill didn't write in first person, but you're right. He was very good at not only establishing a connection with his subjects, but then relating that connection to the reader. And Bill was a citizen of the earth. He liked being around people. He liked telling stories. He was not guarded about his own insecurities as a writer and journalist, which we all have those. My colleagues at SI who worked in the New York office with him talked about him walking the hallway saying, I don't have it. My fastball's gone, in the middle of the night. And he was an open book. He wanted you to know everything he knew. And, there was ego in that too, because we all like to relate a piece of information that we don't think the reader knows yet, but Bill loved to do it in a way that made you feel like you knew the people he was writing about. And you're right, Secretariat was the top of the mountain for him in that he got to know everybody around Secretariat, and he got to know Secretariat, and that story and that book and that movie defined Bill's life as a journalist, and everything else he did. And I think he did stories that were better than anything he wrote about Secretariat, but everything he did would be compared to that.
What's one of his favorite pieces that might not leap to the mind of everybody just reading the flurry of impressive obituaries that have come out?
Yeah, again, I just mentioned this in passing in my obituary. I think it's worth going back and reading the piece he wrote about Rick Pitino, especially now. So much has happened. Pitino was a golden boy when Bill wrote that story in 1991 or 2, just sort of on his, he had been big and he was getting bigger. And Bill got really inside his relationship with his wife and his family. And, it's a fabulous piece of journalism and storytelling from a guy who people don't think of as a basketball writer. It's not a basketball story. It's a story about human beings. And as far as horse racing goes, yeah, I would encourage people to go to the vault and read some of Bill's 2-page stories about a promising 2-year-old and the little turns of phrase he would drop in there. They're all really good. I was really drawn into Bill's style through a 1982 story that he wrote about the failed syndication of Conquistador Cielo, who was the Met Mile and Belmont winner in 1982. Woody's first, I think, of 5. Woody Stevens' first of 5, and he just told this story that started at Saratoga when Conquistador didn't deliver in the Travers because he was hurt, and then backtracked the whole story to the people that went all in on him because he was going to be the stallion of all stallions and produce Derby winners and Belmont winners, and how it all fell apart. And that story taught me so much about how to write about the racetrack. Because it basically went from the millionaires all the way to the backstretch, and it was just it really fascinated me. And I liked the horse too, so I was drawn to the story just because I was into the subject matter. But it really was a great user's guide for me on how you can write about the sport without painting everything as rosy. It was just really good.
Do you have another personal reminiscence of Bill you might like to share before I finally let you go? Thank you for sticking with us today.
It was just, the last time I spent a lot of time with Bill was in December of 2016 at a horse racing symposium in Arizona, which is held every year. And Bill and I were both asked to speak at it to talk about our experiences talking to people and writing about the racetrack. And we went to dinner the first night there, and there was a group of us, and Bill was there. And, Bill had already fought cancer for several years and was somewhat physically diminished, but he wasn't diminished in his spirit, in his excitability in telling stories. And he told stories all night. He told stories about swaps that night. He told stories about Damascus, and, it was just great. And, I just loved seeing him tell those stories. And when that was over, we walked back to our rooms together and just stood in the hallway talking about what it was like to work at Sports Illustrated back in the day, and some of Bill's disappointments at the way his time at SI ended. And it was just great because there was no, when you're talking with, we had a great relationship, but I succeeded him on the beat, and it was Bill's turf, and there was always that little bit of an edge to our conversations, even though he never let on, but you could feel it. And that was all gone by December. It was all gone, and we were just, I was, I wrote in the obit, we took our flights going home, and he said to me, it was a real honor to appear with you. And I said, nope, it was my honor more. And it was great that whatever issues existed just professionally were gone, and I'm just going to remember that really well.
That's fabulous. It sounds like he had that blend of empathy and ego that I think is necessary to be a great writer. And it's fantastic you were able to have that moment with him. And I want to thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Yeah. Thanks a lot. It was great. And, I hope everybody goes back and reads all of Bill's stories 10 times.
Thank you, my friend. There you have it. I want to thank Steve Crist, Bob Curran, and Tim Layden for coming on the show today and sharing their thoughts and reminiscences about the passing of William Nack. Nack, such an important racing writer, so important to me personally. I did try one time to get him to come on to the podcast, but I think I asked at kind of a bad time, and that didn't really follow up properly, and I feel bad that we weren't able to make that happen, because listeners, this is a guy, you read him on the page, you hear his words, really was connected into the magic, not only of horse racing, but storytelling in general, and how that can be elevated. As a writer, I find him intimidating sometimes, inspiring, but intimidating, because I'll look at what he's able to do on the page and say, well, what am I doing trying to write about racing or horse players, when there's somebody out there like him who can capture it in that detail. But I think both Steve Crist and Tim Layden touched on it when you can see what a guy like that can do with words, it inspires you as a writer to do the best you can in whatever medium you have, even if, like me, you're writing 800 words on a deadline. William Nack, his work meant so much to me, and I'm glad we were able to attempt to illustrate a little bit more about his life and work, and hopefully inspire some listeners out there to go ahead and reread some of these stories, whether it's in book form, My Turf, of course, the Secretariat book, the Ruffian book, or through the vault at SI. Check it out. There's a ton of amazing stuff. We're going to end this show a little bit differently than we end most of them. I am going to go ahead and thank co-host Jonathan Kinchin, who helped me prepare for the show today. I definitely want to thank all of you for listening. This show is so much fun to do because of the fact that you're out there taking it in, asking questions, interacting with us, hopefully learning something or being inspired by the life of William Nack today. I want to thank producers Craig and AJ, both of whom put in extra work on today's show. Thank them for their hard work. We're going to end this show the only way I know how, going to be a little bit different than anything we've ever done before. Take it away, Chick Anderson and Big Red.
He's into the stretch. Secretariat leads his field by 18 lengths. And now Tricer Prince has taken second, and Mike Gallant has moved back to third. They're in the stretch. Secretariat